everybody. Welcome back to class. Frank Markow here. I am your instructor for effective conflict intervention, and this week we've got a really important topic for you. We're going to talk about how to deal with conflict in close personal relationships. Now, how many of you are involved in close personal relationships? If you're married, check. If you've got kids, if you've got siblings, if you're close friends or close with the people you work with, you have close personal relationships. And conflict in these kinds of relationships is different from some of the others. There's a lot of other dynamics at work. And so my hope and goal for you is at the end of this lecture, you'll have some better tools to help you navigate the conflict that's going to be that's inevitable in these types of relationships. So we're going to cover the idea of listening, good listening skills. We're also going to talk about the dynamics of close personal relationships and how do we deal with disruptions, i.e. after a conflict or a major life crisis or change. How do we deal with those disruptions in close personal relationships? So hang on to your hat. We've got a lot of ground to cover today. Let's get started. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about today is listening in conflict and the importance of listening. And why do we find it so difficult to listen in conflict? Because part of the challenge here is that when we get in a conflict situation, our emotions rise. And when our emotions rise, that means the blood is rushing to other parts of our bodies and not so much in our head. We're not thinking rationally, right? And so we don't listen as much. We're coming up with our response, or do we want to run away, or how bad do we want this issue? So it's difficult for us to listen in conversations. And not only that, oftentimes we don't feel heard by other people when we're in a conflictual situation. Now, hearing is a natural byproduct of how we're designed. We all hear, you're going to hear, but are you really listening? Listening is not the same thing as hearing. Listening takes intent. It's not passive, it requires focus and attention, and it's a complex task. And so we're going to talk about how to become better listeners today. Now, a scholar by the name of I.A. Richards came up with this idea that there's 4 different types of messages that are coming through when somebody is communicating to us. We all know that it's not just the surface message, right? But there's intentions that are lying beneath the surface that we need to be listening for. And so what are these 4 points of view or messages in the communication? Well, the first one is the sense or the surface meaning, right? So what is the actual factual content that this person is telling us? The classic example is, when the wife says to the husband, does this dress look good on me? And as guys, we're very factual, and we're like, well, if we're smart guys, we say, yes, of course, honey. But what is really the message there? She wants some affirmation. She wants to know that she's beautiful, that she's desirable by you. Right? So sometimes the surface question is not what we're really looking for. And the next one is the feeling or the emotion behind the message. And so when people share with us, there's oftentimes an emotional intent that's coming across. Now, this can come through in their facial expressions, right, in their body language. So if you ask somebody, you ask your kids, how do you like the food here? How do you like this restaurant? And they're like, fine. It's like, okay, yeah, they're saying fine. It's like they're saying they're okay, but you can tell that there's some emotion behind that message. And then, of course, there's tone, right? The tone of voice. And I love what Jerry Seinfeld says about this one. When I got married, before I got married, I didn't realize I had a tone in my voice. But once I got married, I realized I had a tone. And so what is a tone? The tone implies the level of connectedness in the relationship. So if you have a pleasant tone, if you have a high tone, that means, hey, you want to go along, you want to get along, everything's cool in that relationship. But what if you have a dark and menacing tone and you speak real quickly and clipped? Well, maybe you're not happy, right? So again, go back to the situation. Do you like your new office that we're moving you to, Frank? Yeah, it's fine. Okay, now I said yes. I said, yes, I like the office, but my tone of voice conveyed something completely different. Now, oftentimes the tone will be contextual based upon status in a relationship. And this is really interesting, right? So if the president or CEO comes and says, hey, how do you like your new office? Somebody, oh, it's great. Oh, yeah, this is perfect, right? You're taking sort of a deferential tone. But if my coworker comes, right, and so how do you like your new office? You're like, yeah. It's just terrific. I'm pleased as punch with this new office, right? So you're saying you're being kind of sarcastic, and you are showing in your tone there, you're showing that you're equals and that you can relate how you really feel. So sometimes our tone shifts depending upon our status in the relationship. And then, of course, there's the intention or the purpose of the message, right? So oftentimes when people are talking, they're sharing words, but the words aren't exactly what they want to know. Going back, to the example of the wife who asked the husband, well, how do you like this dress, right? So there's a lot of times when we're listening, we don't want to listen just for that sense meaning. And sometimes we're guilty of that, especially in a work context, right? We just listen to what they say, and then we respond based on to just what they say. And we find out later on, like later that day or next week or whatever, that's not really what they were intending to convey to us. There was some sentiment behind it, some emotion behind it, some other purpose. It wasn't just the strict sense. And so as listeners, we have to tune into this idea of listening for the different messages embedded in the communication. So, how would you define what good listening? So good listening then, it means matching the received message to the intended message, right? So we are actually hearing what the person is saying, not just audibly hearing it, but we understand what their true intention is. That's what it means to be a good listener. It doesn't mean that you sit there patiently and you make eye contact, as important as those things are, but it means you really try to get at the intention of the message the person is sending. Now, a couple of scholars by the name of Shannon and Weaver came up with a model that is pretty common. You may have come across this, but this is sort of a basic model of communication. So listening kind of falls in this world of communication. So let's take a look at some of these things and how it helps us to understand to be better listeners and communicators. So in the model here, you have the speaker, and the speaker comes up with an idea, right? Now in this model, this idea here, he's thinking of a tree. That's the idea that he wants to share. And so he encodes it, and he uses a channel. Now the channel might be spoken words, it might be written words, it could be through a text message or a Slack message or an email, but that's the channel that you are encoding the message in. And by the way, there's this idea of media richness, which is important to understand, because the more rich the media is, the better communication can happen, and conversely, the less rich it is, the less communication can happen. So for example, you don't want to communicate something that has some emotional intent or something like that through a very through brief, media-rich environment of a text message, right? So for serious, maybe emotionally laden or heavy conversations, you want to do face-to-face because that's very media-rich. You don't want to, because you lose a lot of communication. You lose a lot in the text. People can't see your tone of voice, right? How many of you have ever gotten an email from somebody and it sounded really serious and you're like, oh man, they're really mad at me. And you go talk to the person and they explain, so no, I just, I didn't have time to ask how was your day and those sorts of things, right? But that's, another point when you're communicating something, make sure you also convey that the nature of the relationship. A little bit of personal sentiment goes a long way in maintaining good relationships with these media that don't have a whole lot of richness. Okay, so we use the media, and then the person receives it, and they decode it, and the idea is received. Now, why is this important? Because sometimes the message that they receive is not the message that we intended to send. Right? This is what's called a miscommunication. So the listener's trying, but there's so many other things wrapped around it that's what they really hear. Now, a scholar by the name of Malcolm McLuhan once said a long time ago, the medium is the message. And what does that mean? Well, it means how we choose to communicate says everything the listener needs to know about what's important. So if you get a terse email from your boss saying this or that, okay, I guess the personal relationship is not as important to that person because they chose just to use an email. Now, I'm not saying bosses can't use email, but sometimes we might feel a little put off or offended. It's like, well, why didn't they tell me that face to face? Or maybe they don't communicate it at all. And you're like, I guess I'm not very important. I don't have much status in that person's life, because the message, the lack of the communication conveys something to us as well. Now, in this illustration here, you've got this guy's thinking about a tree, right? And he says tree, and then the listener, see, he's thinking like, what is that, a maple tree or something? And the listener's thinking like palm tree. So with something very simple like that, it can be miscommunicated. Imagine much more complex things like where you're talking about your feelings or intentions or ideas. So again, you want to match the medium to match the nature of the message and the idea that you're trying to convey. Now, let's get back to listening for a second here. Now, when listening to somebody, here's some ways that we can show we're listening and to actually try to better understand not just the words, but what this person is trying to convey to us actually. So the first thing is to appreciate the task, right? Show appreciation. Sometimes it's hard for people to communicate. You want to let them know that you appreciate them coming to you and sharing. The next is give full attention to the speaker and try to cut off the noise. Don't cut off your nose. Cut off the noise and show the speaker that you're listening. Okay, so eye contact, undivided attention, and may I make a suggestion which may seem kind of radical in this day and age, but put away your dang phone, right? Don't be checking your Apple Watch every time. Have you ever been in a meeting with somebody and you're like, and they're like, That, to me, that communicates tons. To me, that communicates a real lack of seriousness about them. Now, maybe they're a busy person, but you know what? Busy people need to pay attention too. And maybe you're that busy person that's always distracted. Okay, so give people your full attention. Cut off the noise. Turn down the radio. Turn down the podcast. Put away your phone or Apple Watch. And again, depending on the seriousness of it. Now, it's just casual communication. You can be distracted, but if it's a serious conversation, get rid of that distraction. And then work to understand the speaker's meaning, what they're trying to say, and not just the words that they're using. So you might have to ask questions, draw out the meaning, maybe press in a little bit and say, are you trying to get at this or that? And then paraphrase what you think they mean in your own words. And again, not just words, but based upon what they're communicating, their tone of language, tone of voice, etc., etc. So if your wife comes to you and says, how does this dress look? And you say, honey, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my entire life. That's the right answer, right? Okay, she didn't want to know how the dress looks. She just needed to be affirmed. So think about what it is that people are trying to communicate. Clarify, paraphrase it back to them, and make sure you're really listening to what they say. And then, of course, respond and reciprocate. People need a response, and they appreciate that, even if it's painful. That way they know that what they said matters to you. And when people trust us by sharing some sort of privileged communication of their feelings, we should reciprocate back, right? We should share a level of vulnerability and transparency with them. So if somebody comes to you, let's just say in a work context, and shares something really important and kind of sensitive to them, and you just like, okay, we'll work on that one. That's not reciprocating. That's not showing appreciation for the what they divulged to you, the transparency, right? So you always want to acknowledge somebody and appreciate the fact that they were willing to come to you, and to reciprocate and give back information on an equal level. I know how you feel. I understand that. That happened to me one time. I'm going to be praying for you, right, if this is a Christian context. And so you want to equalize. And again, this gets back to this idea of power in communications, right? So the more you equalize the power, and you do this by sharing information about yourself, the less likely there is to be conflict in the situation. Now, if you're the speaker, here's some guidelines for you. First of all, show appreciation to the other party. Don't make demands or you statements, but make I statements. Okay, so we've heard this one before. So you might say, when you did this, I felt this, or this was a problem for me because of this, right? And so we don't want to turn it on them, and we don't want to use I statements to kind of be a backhanded insult or compliment, right? Well, when you do, when you do this, I really think you're being reckless, or you're being an idiot, or something like that, right? It really shows you have poor taste. Well, that's not an I statement. That's not reflecting how you feel. You're sort of using it to kind of get a zinger back on that one. And make sure your intended meaning is getting to the person, right? And you can do a lot to make it easier for people. So especially if it's something complex or nuanced or maybe emotional, do what you can to convey the meaning to them. So make it easier for somebody to understand what you're saying. So maybe make sure your tone of voice is appropriate. You're giving some explanation, right? You're cutting down the noise and all those sorts of things. And then just saying something is not the same as communicating, right? So check for nonverbals, ask people to paraphrase, treat yourself as a partner with the other person. And then create a safe environment and build trust, right? So we talk about psychological safety, right? People aren't going to speak up if they don't feel safe to speak up. And you might wonder why none of your direct reports come to you and share things with you. You have to hear it a week later from somebody else. Well, maybe you're not really creating an environment, a safe environment for them to share, because every time you share with them, or every time they share with you, rather, you are you're interrupting them, or you're giving them their point of view, or you're telling them why they're wrong, right? This is just an information meeting, right? Well, what does that convey to somebody, an information meeting? Well, that means this isn't a safe place for you to share. The decision's been made, so if that's the culture and climate you're creating, don't be too surprised if people are reticent to speak up and to share. And so we want to create environments where in the long term people feel safe and heard and those sorts of things. Now, let me just mention a little difference here between men and women. Now, again, this is generally speaking, this isn't everybody, and this isn't designed to categorize every single person into these. But there has been some research on this that show that men and women do have differences in their communication styles. Women often prioritize emotional sharing and connecting in conversations. They prefer empathetic listening over immediate solutions, especially in emotionally charged context, and as opposed to men who lean more towards solution-oriented approaches. All right, so any of you married guys out there know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Sometimes your wife is sharing with you, and what do? Your wife, well, we're fixers, right? We try to come up with solutions, and so our wives tell us about a problem they're having at work or with their spouse, not their spouse, that's you, about work or their siblings or something like that. And you're listening, you're like, okay, well, here's how you can solve that problem. Guess what? That's not what she wanted from you. She didn't want a solution, right? She wanted you to be empathetic, et cetera, validating her feelings, right? So how do you respond in this kind of situation? Well, ask open-ended questions. Well, what did you think about that? Or validate her feelings with affirming response. That must be so challenging. Boy, I feel for you. I'm going to be praying for you, right? So show that you are understanding and giving empathy and not simply solutions. Look for clues in communications and cross-gender communications. Observe verbal and nonverbal cues to determine if she wants advice or she just wants to vent, right? Sometimes your spouse might want your advice, but you have to find out, right? So you can clarify the intentions if you're not sure. So you can say, do you want help thinking this through, or do you just want to share, right? Now, 9 times out of 10, I got it from my humble experience of being married for over 30 years, they just want to share, right? But sometimes it's appropriate and you can offer help and solutions. And again, be adaptable, recognize that preferences can vary amongst individuals, encourage open communication, and develop an environment where parties feel comfortable to share their communication preferences. All right, just a little sidebar there on the difference between men and women, and a little advice to you brothers out there to help you communicate better with those important women in your life. All right, we're going to shift gears a little bit here and move from listening to dynamic patterns in close relationships. So that sounds exciting. What are we going to talk about here? So, conflict in close personal relationships, or CPR, is important, and this is the kind of conflict that can do the most damage in our relationships, right? But it can also do the most good when we have conflicts, right? So if we learn how to work through conflicts in these close personal relationships in a healthy way, again, it's not the conflict itself, but it's how we deal with the conflict that is critical here. If we learn how to deal with conflict in critical close personal relationships, this can actually strengthen our relationships. And for those of you who've been married for a long time, you've kind of worked through this, and you've learned how to communicate in conflict better, and at the end of the day, you feel closer, right? And maybe you don't always, but if you've been married a long time, you understand that this actually can help you. All right, so what are close personal relationships? Well, this is where there's significant interdependence, emotional involvement, where your identities are intertwined. Now, most of the research here has been done on couples because that's the most obvious, accessible, close personal relationship. But there's other types of close personal relationships too, with work colleagues and those sorts of things. Relationships are more challenging to maintain now than they were in the past. Now, why is that? Well, because we live longer, we have more closer relationships, we last longer. We have more outside interests competing for our attention, right? We don't have as much social support, back in the day when families were closer, tribes, et cetera, et cetera. Now, Gottman, who's done a lot of research on communication and conflict in married, he talks about the most common types of things that couples conflict over. And these include communication, sex, jealousy, in-laws and step-family members, and chores, and financial management, okay? So these are all serious, heavy things, right? When you're talking about your sex life and your money, what's more important and challenging than talking about those things? So you can see how conflict can be potentially lurking in those kinds of conversation. Now remember this, that close personal relationships are dynamic, right? They're not just a thing. It's like, I don't just have a marriage. I'm married. I'm marrying, right? It's sort of like Carl Weeks. He doesn't use the term organization, but he says we are organizing. It's an ongoing process. It's the same thing with your close personal relationships. They're dynamic. They're changing. They're growing. They're evolving. And so if we understand that we have to tend to these close personal relationships, right? This will help us understand that our approach and our needs and our attention needs to change and transform along with these relationships. Now, a scholar by the name of Baxter said there's two things going on at the same time in any close personal relationships. That is that we're drawn together to bond, but we also need autonomy and freedom. And so this is what he called relational dialectics, right? If you're familiar with Hegelian dialectics, it's sort of this back and forth. And there's three main areas here. As I mentioned here, autonomy versus connection, the tension between the desire for independence and the desire for closeness. Openness versus closeness, the push and pull between sharing personal information and retaining privacy. And predictability versus novelty, the balance between seeking stability and routine versus wanting spontaneity and change. All right, so again, for those of you who've been in close personal relationships, you've experienced this, right? It's like you want to be connected, you want to be close, but then like you need your space, and maybe you're not in the same space. And here's one of the things we know about this too, is that oftentimes we can get out of sync with the other person, right? So we may want to feel close to somebody, but they might be on the other end, right? And conversely, somebody else might want to feel close, and we're not feeling like getting close. So chances are you're going to be out of sync with your close personal relationship. And that doesn't mean that the relationship's broken or bad. It's just sort of a natural ebb and flow. And so sometimes we're tempted to freak out or get upset or angry if we want to draw close and they don't. Well, what are you going to do? You're not in sync, right? So the challenge here is to recognize when you're in and when you're out of sync. Now, since we do sort of have this tension, this push-pull, this ebbing here, we can see relationships in close personal relationships, we can see these different stages, these stages of moving apart. And so the stages of moving apart are differentiation. So how am I different? How do I have more autonomy? And then we move to circumscribing, which is communicating less, carving out more life space, not communicating about what you're doing. All right, so this is when you're kind of feeling that drift, and all of a sudden you just go out for a couple hours and you come home and you didn't bother to tell your spouse where you were. You just feel like you needed some space. Now, sometimes you'll go out and you say, honey, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that, right? And you let them know. That's because you're feeling close, right? You're both in sync there with your desire for closeness. Sometimes you don't. You just kind of get away, hole up. You have more time for yourself. And then if you continue to separate there, your relationships hit stagnation and your conversations go flat. And then, of course, there's avoidance and then termination. Now, I'm not talking about marriage and divorce here, but you can sort of see these kinds of things happening in close personal relationships when people allow their communication, their conflict to fester to the point where they just sort of separate. So when these stages arise, you need to recognize them and address the conflicts as they arise. Put conflicts on the table. Cycle back to that experiment stage, right, where we're just getting to know each other, we're just starting to date and figure each other out. To keep it close, you need to move back and intensify and to integrate with the significant other person. Again, this is hard work. We all know it's hard work, right? If you've been married a while, you know this is hard work. But this will help build closeness and trust. Now, this John Gottman, as I mentioned earlier, he's a well-known figure in this whole area of relationships and communication and conflict. He talks about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and these are the 4 horsemen. In other words, if you see these signs a-coming, your marriage is in for trouble. Okay, so you want to recognize these kinds of stages: complaining and criticizing, showing contempt, becoming defensive, stonewalling, maybe this excessive separation. And so in his research on couples, he noted, and he's done a lot of research on that, if these things were present and prevalent, that marriage was doomed. And so if you start to see these things, you need to react quickly and respond quickly, because these are the early warning signs that something is going on in your relationship. Now, we also mentioned this idea earlier about communication, about conflict styles. Remember, accommodating and avoiding and those sorts of things? Well, couples in close personal relationships also have a pattern, a style, if you will. Maybe it's an avoiding style, right? Maybe your family was very much avoidant and you didn't talk about things that were conflictable. Or maybe your style was very open and you conflicted regularly, right? And so we sort of bring those things with us into these close personal relationships. I know with my spouse, we had to kind of figure this one out early. I came from a family that was very open and converse, and hers wasn't. And so we kind of had to work through how we were going to communicate about conflictual things in a way where we both understood each other. And so again, just remember the natural ebb and flow, that this is normal. And if you see that stagnation stage, then that's when you know you need to do something. All right, so in summary, we can apply the basic strategies of conflict management to these close personal relationships. So everything we talked about, goals, right, and understanding emotions and the different styles that we have, we can apply all these things to close personal relationships. Understanding relational dynamics and patterns, right? So start to look for patterns in your relationships and recognize signs and work towards collaboration. So out of those 5 different styles, conflict styles, collaboration should be the one that you go for in your close personal relationships. Not avoiding, not competing, but collaboration. And finally, let's talk about disruptions in close relationships and the impact of conflict. Now, because the stakes are so much higher in close personal relationships, a conflict that's not handled well can disrupt your life and undermine your sense of identity. And the risks of both speaking up and listening are greater because of the strong emotions that are involved. And as I mentioned, there's also greater opportunity to get the conflict resolved and to strengthen your relationships because of the conflict. So Fisher and Brown, by the way, you remember Fisher and Urey of the Harvard negotiation? Well, he's the same guy, and they wrote another book called Getting Together. And so they come up with some ideas for managing conflict in close personal relationships. And here's some of their guidelines. First one is balance emotion with reason, and use both of those, and don't let one dominate. And again, men tend to be more, using reasons and facts and those sorts of things. You're not going to win a conversation. You're not going to win a conflict with your spouse that way, because maybe you're right about the facts, but you're wrong about how she is feeling about this situation. Okay, so in any conflictual relationship, understand people have emotions and feelings about things. Maybe there's things unstated, they're not on the table, and so you can't reason your way through. Well, let me tell you 3 reasons why we should do this, and let me tell you 5 reasons why you're wrong about this. And maybe you're 100% accurate on that, but that is not going to help you draw close. And again, the goal here is to maintain your relationships, right? These are close, important relationships. And so you want to maintain that relationship. And so understanding that reasoning isn't the only thing that comes into working through a conflict. The next is get interested in how other people see and feel. And we talked early on about the lens model, right? Shifting your perspective. So trying to understand your spouses or other important relationship, understanding their perspective. What do they need? What do they need? Always consult on anything that may have impact on the other person. So again, in a relationship, this might be about like spending money, right? So let's just say you have your eye on something. Now, I'm a musician, right? I like to buy lots of guitars and amps and stuff like that. Well, maybe I have my eye on something, and one day I come home and say, honey, look, I just bought this new guitar. And she's like, well, how much did that cost? Oh, it was only $2,000. It was on sale. She's like, $2,000? You've got 10 guitars already. Why do you need another one? Okay, I would never, now, early on in the marriage, I may have done that, but I would never do that now. I would save up my money. I would let my wife know that I'm doing this, and here's why I'm doing it, et cetera, et cetera. And so you want to consult on anything that impacts the other person, because these are your family's finances, right? So anytime the person might be, they might want to weigh in on something, you want to have a communication. You want to talk about, consult on those sorts of things. Of course, be trustworthy, right? Be trustworthy, but also don't be wholly trusting, right? So in other words, you want to trust people, but you also want to allow people the space. Well, what am I trying to say here? Nobody is 100% trustworthy. And so if you trust people 100%, sometimes you need to, like Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify, right? Avoid coercion, right? So you don't want to convict, you don't want to kind of squeeze people, kind of convince them to do things. And then, of course, practice acceptance. We'd be much happier in our relationships if we realize that it's not our job to change people, right? They're going to change in time with the Lord's help, just as we are, right? So if our goal in a marriage is to try to change the other person, you're going to be perpetually unhappy, and so are they. So practice acceptance. Here's some other things. We mentioned this earlier in the class, but you don't have to act on your feelings. You might be feeling hurt about something. That doesn't mean you need to storm out or get angry, raise your voice. Again, this has to do with emotional intelligence, understanding and controlling your emotions. Create a safe environment for expressing feelings. I talked a little bit about that earlier, but even in your home environment, let your spouse know this is a safe place, especially in a home environment. This is a safe place for you to share how you feel. Create equality and power dynamics. Create reciprocity, give back information equal to what you're receiving. Give plenty of positive feedback, right? Now, we know this is important, this idea of affirming people when they do the right thing. So if we've agreed to do something, if your spouse has agreed to do something and they do it, affirm them. Say, hey, I've noticed this. I really appreciate that. Because if you don't notice, chances are they'll say, oh, I've done all this hard work, and they haven't noticed that they might lapse back in. So the more you can notice and affirm that people have made progress or changed and done what they've done, the chances are that behavior is going to stick. Now, how do we create safe environments? Well, some couples like to do a regular check-in, maybe a weekly or a monthly. Find a time that works for you. Maybe if you have kids and your kids are older now and you want them to be involved in your conversations, have family meeting times, and don't just make them like when there's a crisis. Sometimes there's a tendency to say, well, we only meet when there's a crisis or a problem. People will dread those meetings like the plague, right? So if you have a time where we just meet and touch base, check in, how's it going? Especially if you have kids, as they're getting older, they want to participate and they want to feel like a valued, important member of the family. So bring your kids into the family meetings as well. You should schedule those, again, once a month, once a quarter, once every couple of weeks, especially if you're trying to get through something, right? Maybe there's a crisis. You want to communicate more often, regularly about those things. Now, what's a critical communication context? It is when things that disrupt the normal way of life, right? So imagine there's an illness in the family. Maybe your spouse gets sick, or maybe one of your parents dies, or something tragic happens, with the child, or something like that. God forbid these things should happen, but sometimes we have these critical contexts, these emergencies, these disruptions, and our tendency might be to sort of shut off and not communicate at all, right? Well, the literature suggests that we're going to have a better chance of maintaining closeness in the relationship, if we do a better job of communicating throughout it. And so we can't prevent these critical communication contacts because they're going to happen. But the communication becomes more critical during them, even though it's more difficult. So this is kind of the paradoxical tension, right? Is communication is more important, but it's become more difficult during these times. So here's some advice here, give yourself some space, appreciate the situation, understand that you're going through a lot, your family members are going through a lot, your spouse goes through a lot, etc., etc. So show appreciation for those things. Remember, you can't avoid those things altogether. Appreciate the situation, have lots of grace, lots of empathy, open up communication, don't shut down. Don't run away from taboo topics, right? So sometimes, let's just say you find out, one of your children has come out as homosexual, right? That's painful. That's difficult, right? That's a real challenging thing for Christian parents. But that's not the time where you clam up and you go into your corners and mull it over. You need to have conversations about these things. How do we feel about this? What is our response going to be to our child? And seek professional help, right? Sometimes these situations require a little bit more than we know. In bringing in a third party, family counseling can do wonders to help you work through some of these situations. And then there might be a new normal, right? So things might be different now as a result of this. And so John Gottman urges us to celebrate the struggle of surviving these disruptive events. So if you make it through this event and you kind of get back to, stability, maybe not the same, but stability and happiness, then that goes a long way. You should celebrate that, recognize that as an accomplishment, as a point of growth in your relationship. Well, listen, that's all I've got to say about this. Sort of some heavy stuff here. We talk about close family relationships, but maybe some of these ideas will help you navigate these situations, listening better in your close personal relationships and dealing with these critical incidences that arise in life. Thanks for listening so much. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.